You walk into a room and immediately know who's lying, not because of their body language or what they're saying, but because something deeper whispers the truth to you. You dream about your friend's breakup 3 weeks before it happens. The images are so vivid, you wake up with their pain in your chest. But when you try to warn them, they brush it off as coincidence. You avoid certain people at work because they make your skin crawl, though everyone else thinks they're nice. 3 months later, you find out they've been embezzling money. You sit in meetings and watch the unspoken dynamics play out like a movie. Who really holds the power? Who's planning to quit? Which projects will fail before anyone's even admitted there's a problem? And when you try to explain any of this, they look at you like you've lost your mind. If this sounds familiar, you might be what Carl Jung called the most dangerous personality type to be born with. Not dangerous to others, dangerous to yourself. Jung spent decades studying what he termed intuitive introverts, people whose minds operate like psychic antennas, picking up signals from dimensions most people can't even perceive. In his clinical interviews, he described meeting patients who could walk into a room and immediately know intimate details about a stranger's psychology, who could sense the emotional undercurrents of any situation with uncanny accuracy, who lived their entire lives feeling like they were inhabitants of 2 worlds simultaneously. But here's what the YouTube psychology channels won't tell you about this supposed gift. It comes with a curse so devastating that Jung called it one of the most difficult lives a person could live. You see, while everyone else gets to live in one reality, the concrete, observable world of facts and logic, you're forced to navigate 2 realities simultaneously. There's the world everyone else sees, and then there's the shadow world you perceive. The world of hidden motives, future possibilities, and archetypal patterns that play out beneath the surface of ordinary life. And the psychological toll of this double existence, it's staggering. You start to question which reality is real. You begin to wonder if you're crazy. You learn to stay silent about what you see, because sharing it only leads to isolation and misunderstanding. But silence becomes its own prison. Because the visions don't stop, the insights don't pause, the overwhelming flood of unconscious information continues to pour through your mind every single day, and you have nowhere to put it. And if you don't learn to navigate this properly, it will slowly eat you alive from the inside. Today, we're going far beyond surface-level personality typing. We're diving into Jung's actual clinical observations about why intuitive introverts often end up isolated, misunderstood, and questioning their own sanity. We're exploring the specific psychological traps that await this type, and why so many gifted individuals end up broken by their own gifts. More importantly, we're exploring the 3-stage journey every intuitive introvert must navigate to transform their greatest weakness into their most powerful strength. Because the difference between thriving and barely surviving as this type isn't about learning to trust your intuition. It's about learning to survive it without losing yourself in the process. To understand why this type is so dangerous to possess, we need to understand exactly how your mind works differently from everyone else's. Carl Jung identified 4 basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Most people rely heavily on sensation, what they can see, hear, touch, and measure. Their reality is grounded in the immediate, the provable, the concrete. But for the intuitive introvert, sensation is the weakest function. Instead, your dominant function is what Jung called introverted intuition, and this is where things get psychologically dangerous. Jung described introverted intuition as perception via the unconscious. While other people's minds skim across the surface of reality, yours plunges directly into the depths. You don't just see what is, you see what's beneath what is, the hidden patterns, the archetypal structures, the collective unconscious content that most people never access. In Jung's own words, introverted intuition is directed upon the inner object. meaning the elements of the unconscious mind itself. You're literally perceiving psychological realities that don't have physical form, but are more real than anything in the material world. Think about that for a moment. Your primary way of understanding reality is through a function that most people don't even know exists. While they're asking, "What happened?" you're asking, "What does this mean?" While they're focused on facts, you're tracking the invisible forces that create those facts. While they're living in the present, you're seeing 3 moves ahead in the cosmic chess game. Jung described this beautifully when he said that for the intuitive introvert, inner objects appear to the intuitive perception as subjective images of things, which, though not to be met with in external experience, really determine the contents of the unconscious. Translation: you see the blueprints of reality before reality builds itself. But here's where the danger begins. Because sensation is your weakest function, you have very little anchor to the present moment. You struggle to stay grounded in your body, in concrete reality, in the here and now. Your attention is constantly being pulled toward the symbolic realm, the world of meanings and possibilities, and archetypal patterns. This creates what Jung called an extraordinary aloofness from tangible reality. You become, in his words, a complete enigma to your immediate circle. And this is just the beginning of the problems. You see, when your mind operates primarily in the realm of symbols and unconscious content, 3 specific psychological traps are waiting for you. Traps that Jung observed repeatedly in his clinical practice. Traps that can transform your greatest gift into a source of profound suffering. The first trap is what Jung called archetypal inflation. The second is what modern psychology recognizes as psychic contamination. And the third is the most dangerous of all, what Jung described as possession by the unconscious. Over the next 15 minutes, we're going to explore each of these traps in detail. We're going to understand exactly how they develop, why they're so seductive, and most importantly, how to navigate them without losing your sanity or your gifts. Because Jung discovered something remarkable in his work with intuitive introverts. Those who learn to navigate these traps don't just survive their psychological complexity, they become some of the most transformative figures in human history. Every intuitive introvert's journey follows the same 3 stages, whether they realize it or not. Stage 1 is the gift, the early discovery of your intuitive abilities, and the intoxicating sense of seeing what others cannot see. Stage 2 is the curse, when that gift becomes overwhelming, isolating, and potentially destructive. Stage 3 is the integration, learning to channel your abilities without being consumed by them. Most people get stuck in stage 2. Today, we're going to understand why and how to move beyond it. Stage 1 typically begins in childhood or adolescence, though some people don't recognize it until much later in life. It's that moment when you first realize your mind works differently. Maybe you're the kid who always knows when adults are lying. Maybe you're the teenager who can predict which couples will break up just by watching them interact for 5 minutes. Maybe you're the young adult who keeps having dreams that come true, or who gets feelings about people that are always accurate. At first, this feels incredible. You feel chosen, special, like you've been given a secret superpower that most people don't possess. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. He described meeting a young woman who told him, within the first few minutes of their session, intimate details about his own psychology that she couldn't possibly have known through conventional means. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply describing what she saw when she looked at him. This is the seductive power of introverted intuition. You don't just meet people, you see through them. You don't just observe situations, you understand their hidden dynamics instantly. You don't just live life, you perceive the archetypal patterns that govern everyone's behavior. In stage 1, this feels like having X-ray vision for the human soul. You can walk into any room and immediately sense who has real power, who's pretending, who's in pain, who's dangerous. You can predict outcomes before anyone else sees the signs. You can understand people better than they understand themselves. And for a while, this seems like pure gift. But Jung noticed something disturbing about people in this stage. They often develop what he called a dangerous contempt for the outer world. Because their inner perceptions are so rich and accurate, they begin to dismiss concrete reality as somehow inferior or irrelevant. Why focus on mundane details when you can see cosmic patterns? Why pay attention to surface conversations when you can perceive the unconscious dynamics beneath them? Why ground yourself in the present when you can live in the realm of pure meaning? This is where the first crack in the foundation appears. Because sensation, your connection to the body, to the present moment, to concrete reality, begins to atrophy. You start living more and more in your head, in the world of symbols and possibilities and future visions. You become what Jung described as extraordinarily aloof from tangible reality. And slowly, very slowly, you begin to notice that your gift is creating problems in your relationships. Friends get uncomfortable when you see through their facades. Family members accuse you of being too intense or reading too much into things. Romantic partners feel exposed, like they can't hide anything from you, and that level of transparency becomes suffocating for them. You start to realize that while your insights are accurate, sharing them often damages your connections with others. People don't want to be understood that deeply. They don't want their unconscious motivations revealed. They don't want their future problems predicted. So you begin to learn the first survival skill of the intuitive introvert: silence. You start keeping your perceptions to yourself. You learn to nod and smile when people tell you things you already knew. You develop a social mask that hides the depth of what you're actually seeing. But this creates a new problem, because now you're living a double life. Your inner world of rich, meaningful perceptions, and your outer world of pretending to be normal. And the pressure of maintaining this double existence begins to build. Jung called this the great disadvantage of the intuitive introvert. He said, they learn to keep things to themselves, and you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. That is a great disadvantage, but it is an enormous advantage in another way. The advantage? Your perceptions become even more refined when you're forced to process them internally. The disadvantage: you begin to feel profoundly alone in the world. And this loneliness, the sense of living between worlds, sets the stage for stage 2. Because when your gift becomes your prison, when your greatest strength becomes your source of deepest isolation, the psychological dangers Jung warned about begin to emerge. Stage 2 is where most intuitive introverts get stuck. It's where the gift transforms into a curse, and where Jung's darkest warnings about this type become reality. By this stage, you've learned to keep your perceptions to yourself. You've developed the social skills necessary to function in the outer world. But internally, you're drowning in a flood of unconscious content that has nowhere to go. Jung identified 3 specific psychological traps that emerge during this stage. Each one is seductive. Each one promises relief from the burden of your consciousness. And each one can destroy you if you don't understand what's happening. The first trap Jung called archetypal inflation. This happens when your ego begins to identify with the powerful archetypal content you're perceiving. Remember, as an intuitive introvert, you have direct access to what Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that govern all human behavior. You see the archetypal roles people play: the mother, the father, the hero, the sage, the destroyer. But in stage 2, something dangerous happens. Instead of simply perceiving these archetypes, you begin to identify with them. You start to see yourself as the wise one, who understands what others cannot see. You become the prophet who perceives truths that the masses are too blind to recognize. You transform into the wounded healer who must sacrifice their own well-being to help an unconscious world. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. He described patients who became convinced they were receiving special messages from the universe, who believed they had been chosen for sacred missions, who developed a sense of grandiose specialness that separated them from ordinary humanity. And here's the insidious part. Your perceptions are still accurate. You are seeing things others miss. You do understand patterns they can't recognize. But your ego has become inflated by this knowledge, and you lose the ability to distinguish between your human self and the archetypal content flowing through you. This is what Jung meant when he warned about possession by the unconscious. You stop being a person who perceives archetypal patterns and become someone who believes they are the archetype. The second trap is what modern psychology calls psychic contamination, though Jung described it in different terms. Because your intuitive function is so sensitive to unconscious content, you don't just perceive other people's psychological patterns, you absorb them. Your boundaries between self and other become permeable, almost dissolving. You walk into a room and not only sense that someone is depressed, you become depressed. You don't just recognize that your friend is anxious about their relationship. Their anxiety becomes your anxiety. You don't just perceive your family's dysfunction, you take responsibility for healing it. Jung observed that intuitive introverts often lose the ability to distinguish between their own psychological content and the psychological content they're perceiving in others. You become what he called a psychic sponge, absorbing the emotional and unconscious material of everyone around you. This creates a devastating secondary problem. You begin to lose your sense of individual identity. Because you're so attuned to everyone else's inner world, you forget what belongs to you and what belongs to them. You start taking responsibility for other people's pain. You feel guilty for problems you didn't create. You exhaust yourself trying to heal wounds that aren't yours. You become addicted to being needed, because being needed feels like the only way to justify your overwhelming sensitivity. But the cost is enormous. You disappear into other people's stories, and your own life becomes secondary to everyone else's psychological drama. The third trap is the most dangerous of all: the complete breakdown of your ability to distinguish between symbolic reality and concrete reality. By stage 2, you've spent years living primarily in the world of symbols, meanings, and archetypal patterns. Your connection to sensation, to your body, to the present moment, to concrete facts, has become so underdeveloped that you begin to lose touch with consensual reality entirely. Jung described meeting patients who could no longer tell the difference between a symbolic vision and a literal prediction, who interpreted every synchronicity as a personal message from the universe, who lived in a constant state of magical thinking, where everything was meaningful and nothing was random. This is what Jung meant when he said the intuitive introvert faces the danger of falling victim to the shadow. Your greatest gift, the ability to perceive the invisible, becomes your greatest weakness when you can no longer distinguish between what's symbolically true and what's literally true. You start seeing conspiracies where there are only coincidences. You interpret ordinary events as cosmic signs. You lose the ability to engage with practical reality because symbolic reality has become more compelling. And at this point, you face a crucial choice. You can surrender to the chaos, allowing yourself to be completely consumed by the unconscious content flowing through you. Or you can begin the difficult work of integration. Most people choose surrender because integration seems impossible. How do you honor your perceptions without being possessed by them? How do you maintain your sensitivity without losing your sanity? How do you stay true to your gift without destroying your life? This is where stage 3 begins. The stage Jung reserved for the rare individuals who learn to dance with their demons instead of being devoured by them. Stage 3 is where the real work begins. It's where you learn to be a bridge between worlds instead of a victim of your own consciousness. Jung believed that successfully integrated intuitive introverts had the potential to become some of the most transformative figures in human history. Why? Because they could access unconscious content that most people never perceive, but they could also translate that content into forms that others could understand and use. But integration requires mastering 3 specific skills that most psychology channels never discuss. These aren't feel-good affirmations or surface-level coping strategies. These are psychological technologies that Jung developed through decades of clinical work with this type. The first skill is learning to deliberately develop your weakest function, sensation. This isn't about suppressing your intuition. It's about creating an anchor to concrete reality that allows your intuition to function safely. Jung observed that unintegrated intuitive introverts live almost entirely in their heads. They lose connection to their bodies, to the present moment, to the physical world. This makes them vulnerable to being swept away by unconscious content. The reality anchoring practice involves developing what Jung called conscious relationship with the inferior function. Every day, you deliberately engage with the physical world in ways that strengthen your connection to sensation. This might mean a daily walking meditation where you focus entirely on your feet touching the ground. Regular physical exercise that brings you into your body. Cooking meals where you pay attention to textures, smells, and tastes. Gardening where you literally work with earth and growing things. But here's the crucial part. You're not trying to become a sensation type. You're creating a stable foundation that allows your intuition to operate without overwhelming you. Jung described this as the marriage of opposites. Your sensation function becomes the container that holds your intuitive insights, preventing them from flooding your consciousness chaotically. The second skill is learning to translate your perceptions into forms that others can understand and use. This is what Jung called giving form to the formless. Most intuitive introverts keep their insights trapped in their inner world because they don't know how to communicate what they see. But integration requires finding ways to bring your perceptions into the outer world through concrete expression. For some, this means artistic expression, painting the visions, writing the stories, composing the music that captures the archetypal patterns you perceive. For others, it means intellectual translation, turning your insights into frameworks, theories, or practical wisdom that others can apply. The key is finding your unique form of translation. Jung himself did this through his psychological theories. He took his direct experience of archetypal content and transformed it into concepts like the collective unconscious, the shadow, and the process of individuation. But translation serves a dual purpose. It doesn't just help others understand your perceptions, it helps you integrate them. When you give form to your insights, they stop being chaotic inner experiences and become structured, manageable knowledge. Think of it as developing a pressure release valve for your consciousness. Instead of accumulating endless amounts of unconscious content with nowhere to put it, you create channels through which that content can flow outward constructively. The third skill is the most crucial, learning to maintain healthy psychological boundaries while staying open to unconscious content. Jung observed that intuitive introverts often swing between 2 extremes: complete openness that leads to psychic contamination, or complete closure that cuts them off from their gifts. Integration requires finding the middle path. The boundary framework involves developing what Jung called conscious permeability. You learn to consciously choose when to open to unconscious content and when to close yourself off from it. This means developing specific practices for psychic protection. Before entering overwhelming social situations, you might visualize protective barriers around your energy field. After intense interactions, you create cleansing rituals that help you release absorbed psychological material. But the framework also involves learning to distinguish between different types of perceptions. You develop the ability to recognize when an insight is genuinely intuitive versus when it's projection, anxiety, or wishful thinking. Jung called this developing conscious discrimination. You become able to sort through the constant stream of unconscious content flowing through your awareness and identify what's genuinely valuable versus what's psychological noise. Most importantly, you learn to maintain your individual identity while engaging with archetypal content. You can perceive the archetypal patterns without identifying with them. You can understand other people's psychological dynamics without taking responsibility for healing them. You develop what Jung called standpoint, a stable sense of self that can engage with the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. When these three skills come together, something remarkable happens. Your sensitivity transforms from a burden into a genuine gift, not just for you, but for everyone whose life you touch. You become what Jung called a bridge between the conscious and unconscious worlds. You can access insights that others miss, but you can also communicate those insights in ways that help and heal, rather than overwhelm or confuse. You develop the ability to see patterns and possibilities while staying grounded in practical reality. You can offer profound guidance while maintaining healthy boundaries. You can live authentically as yourself while honoring the archetypal content that flows through you. And perhaps most importantly, you stop feeling like an alien in your own life. You find your people, other integrated intuitive introverts who understand your experience. You discover your purpose, the unique way you're meant to translate unconscious wisdom for the world. To understand why you develop this double life, we need to examine what Jung observed during his 60 years of clinical practice with this specific psychological type. In his landmark 1957 interview with Dr. Richard Evans from the University of Houston, Jung made a crucial observation that explains the entire phenomenon. So you see, if the introverted intuitive would speak what he really perceives, then practically no one would understand it. He would be misunderstood. And so they learn to keep things to themselves. And you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. Notice three critical elements in Jung's observation. First, he doesn't say they choose to keep things to themselves. He says they learn to. This implies a conditioning process. Repeated experiences that teach them silence is safer than authenticity. Second, he doesn't say they're naturally secretive. He says they become secretive after repeatedly being misunderstood. This is reactive behavior, not inherent personality. Third, Jung observed that this learning process is so complete that you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. They don't just hide their perceptions from strangers. They stop expressing them entirely, even to themselves. But Jung went deeper. He observed that this creates what he called a great disadvantage, but an enormous advantage in another way. The disadvantage? You become emotionally cut off from authentic connection, even with people you love. The advantage? You develop an extraordinary ability to instantly read human psychology that becomes more refined precisely because you're forced to process it internally. For instance, they come into the presence of somebody they don't know, and suddenly they have inner images, and these images give them more or less complete information about the psychology of the partner. But Jung also warned about the cost of sharing these perceptions prematurely. But it, of course, can also happen that they come into the presence of somebody who they don't know at all, and they know an important piece out of the biography of that person, and are not aware of it, and tell the story, and then the hat is in the fire. This is where Jung's clinical observations become crucial. He noticed that this adaptive splitting doesn't happen in isolation. It triggers what he called compensatory mechanisms throughout the entire psychological system. When your dominant function is introverted intuition, Your inferior function is extroverted sensation. This means your natural connection to physical reality, present moment awareness, and bodily experience is underdeveloped. Jung observed that the psyche cannot tolerate this imbalance indefinitely. In his clinical notes, he documented how the unconscious mind attempts to compensate through what he called the inferior function. What the introverted intuitive represses most of all is the sensation of the object, and this colors his whole unconscious. It gives rise to a compensatory extroverted sensation function of an archaic character. The unconscious personality can best be described as an extroverted sensation type of a rather low and primitive order. Instinctuality and intemperance are the hallmarks of this sensation, combined with an extraordinary dependence on sense-oppressions. Let's examine what Jung observed in his practice. This compensatory function manifests as primitive sensation seeking, obsessive behaviors around physical activities, unexplained physical ailments, and chronic fatigue, overwhelming reactions to lights, sounds, textures, and crowds, and excessive dependence on external objects or people for grounding. Jung noted, this was the psyche's unconscious attempt to force connection to physical reality when the conscious mind had become too detached from the body and present moment. This explains why many intuitive introverts experience unexplained physical symptoms, chronic exhaustion, and overwhelming sensitivity to environments. Your unconscious mind is trying to balance your disconnect from physical reality, but it's doing so in unconscious, often disruptive ways. The exhaustion isn't just from social performance. It's from your entire psychological system working overtime to compensate for the split between your inner perceptual world and your outer adaptive behavior. Now let's explore how Jung's clinical observations manifest in your daily experience. He documented specific patterns that create and maintain the psychological split, mechanisms that operate so automatically you might not even recognize them. Jung observed that the double life develops through what he described as psychological fragmentation in relationships. You begin to operate in two distinct modes in every interaction, and over time, these modes become so separate that you lose track of which one is authentic. Jung identified a core mechanism in his clinical work. In intimate relationships, you develop two distinct ways of being. There's the perceiving self, who sees your partner's psychology clearly, understands their unconscious motivations, and can predict their behavioral patterns. Then there's the performing self, who pretends to discover things slowly, acts surprised by developments you saw coming, and carefully times insights to appear as natural observations rather than instant knowing. This creates profound intimacy barriers. You find yourself editing your responses to appear less knowing than you are. You pretend to gradually realize things you understood immediately. You ask questions you already know the answers to. You act surprised by behavior you predicted weeks earlier. You carefully time when to reveal insights to avoid seeming too much. Jung observed that this creates what he documented as barriers to authentic intimacy. Your partner falls in love with the performing self, the version that discovers things at normal speed, has normal reactions, needs normal amounts of information. But your perceiving self, the one doing the actual relationship work, remains hidden and unknown. This creates profound loneliness, even within intimate partnerships. Jung also documented how this splitting manifests in professional settings. He noted that intuitive introverts are naturally drawn to professions that utilize their psychological perception abilities: healthcare, counseling, teaching, management. But these same professions often have cultures that pathologize or dismiss intuitive ways of knowing. This creates what Jung observed as excessive professional persona development. In healthcare settings, you sense a patient's emotional state immediately, but frame it as clinical observation. You predict complications before symptoms appear, but present it as experience-based concern. You know family dynamics instantly, but document them as observed interactions. You feel the energy of dying patients, but discuss it only in medical terminology. Jung documented that this creates exhaustion not from the work itself, but from the constant cognitive load of translating intuitive insights into professionally acceptable language. You develop elaborate rationales for decisions that were actually based on immediate psychological perception. Perhaps most revealing were Jung's observations about unconscious physical strategies. Because your inferior sensation function makes you hypersensitive to environmental stimuli, you develop specific physical strategies to manage psychological overwhelm. Jung observed patients avoiding eye contact because they experienced direct psychological transmission through visual connection. Eye contact creates a direct channel for unconscious psychological material. Patients would wear hats or sunglasses, creating physical barriers that the psyche interprets as energetic protection. They choose seats with backs to walls, controlling psychological exposure. Jung also identified confusion between your own emotional content and absorbed material from others. When you suppress your natural psychological boundaries to fit social expectations, you lose the ability to distinguish between your own psychological content and others' emotional material. You walk into a room and immediately feel depressed without knowing why. You experience anxiety that clearly belongs to someone else. You take on others' emotional states without realizing it. In Jung's model, healthy introverted intuition operates with what he called permeable but conscious boundaries. You can sense others' psychological states without absorbing them because you maintain awareness of the difference between self and other. But when you're forced to suppress this function or hide your perceptions, Jung observed that the boundaries become either too rigid or too permeable. Jung documented the most psychologically damaging aspect, the constant cognitive load of functional suppression. Every interaction requires multiple layers of processing. You immediately understand the psychological dynamics, then assess whether sharing your perception is safe, then deliver a carefully edited version while monitoring reactions and adjusting in real time, all while managing your own frustration and any emotional content you've absorbed. Jung compared this to forcing a naturally left-handed person to write with their right hand all day. The mental energy required is enormous because you're working against your psychological grain. Over time, you develop protective linguistic patterns. Instead of saying, "I can see this relationship is going to end badly," you learn to say, "I have some concerns about the dynamics here." Instead of, "Your mother is manipulating you through guilt," you say, "What do you think about your interaction patterns with your mom?" Jung observed that this constant linguistic editing creates fragmentation of authenticity. You begin to lose touch with your natural voice because you're always translating it into something more palatable. Patients would tell Jung they couldn't remember how to just say what they see anymore. Everything came out filtered. Jung also noted that intuitive introverts develop artificial expressions of uncertainty, expressing doubt about perceptions they're actually certain about. "I might be wrong, but," when you know you're not. "This is probably nothing, but," when you know it's significant. "Maybe I'm overthinking this," when your insight is accurate. Jung observed that this serves two functions: social protection and ego protection. If you're wrong, you've already acknowledged uncertainty. If others reject your insight, you can tell yourself you weren't really committed to it. But Jung warned that this creates anxiety about your own perceptions. You begin to doubt your own abilities because you've trained yourself to express them as uncertain. Jung was explicit about what this psychological splitting costs you over time. His clinical observations revealed specific patterns of deterioration that he documented across decades of practice. The first cost Jung identified was fragmentation of identity. When you constantly perform a version of yourself that's inauthentic, what Jung termed the ego-self relationship becomes disrupted. You begin to lose touch with which thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are genuinely yours versus which ones are adapted for others. In his notes, Jung documented patients saying things like, "I don't know what I actually think anymore. I can't tell if I'm upset or if I picked it up from someone else. And I've been performing normal for so long, I forgot what my real reactions are." Jung described a fundamental paradox. The more successfully you adapt to social expectations, the more you lose contact with your authentic psychological core. This creates what Jung termed displacement from your essential self, feeling like a stranger in your own life. Jung observed that the constant vigilance required to monitor and edit your responses creates what modern neuroscience would recognize as chronic stress response activation. He documented specific symptoms in his clinical practice: chronic fatigue that rest doesn't resolve, unexplained headaches and body aches, digestive issues and sleep disturbances, hypersensitivity to lights, sounds, and crowds. Jung understood this through his compensation theory. Your inferior sensation function becomes hyperactive and dysregulated when your dominant intuitive function is suppressed. The psyche is trying to ground itself through the body, but it's doing so in chaotic, uncontrolled ways. Jung observed that patients' bodies were essentially rebelling against the psychological splitting, demanding attention through symptoms. Jung documented a fundamental contradiction in his intuitive introvert patients. The better they became at social adaptation, the lonelier they felt in their relationships. This happens because people fall in love with your adapted persona, not your authentic self. Jung documented cases where patients felt completely unknown by their spouses, even in marriages spanning decades. Partners who love the version of you that needs explanations for things you already know. Family members who want your guidance, but get uncomfortable when you're too accurate. Jung noted that many intuitive introverts become so skilled at adaptation that they lose the ability to recognize when someone could handle their authenticity. They assume everyone needs the adapted version, missing opportunities for genuine connection. Jung observed that intuitive introverts who remain in the splitting pattern often experience what he called arrest of creative development. Their natural gifts remain underdeveloped because they're never fully expressed. Your career may plateau not because you lack ability, but because you're working from your adapted skills rather than your natural strengths. Jung documented cases of therapists who were brilliant but couldn't explain their methods, teachers who could transform students but worked within rigid curricula, managers who could predict organizational dynamics but waited for data to act. Jung noted that many of his intuitive introvert patients lived with a persistent sense that they were meant for something more, but couldn't identify what that was. This was often because their true gifts had been so deeply buried under adaptive personas that they'd lost touch with them. Jung warned that without conscious intervention, these costs compound exponentially. The splitting becomes more elaborate, the adapted persona becomes more rigid, and the authentic self becomes more buried. He observed patients who had developed such complex adaptive systems that they couldn't access their genuine responses, even in therapy. Jung documented that many intuitive introverts eventually reach what he called a compensation crisis, a point where the unconscious can no longer maintain the split. This often manifests as depression, anxiety, mysterious physical symptoms, or what Jung termed a crisis of meaning, a profound sense that life has become empty despite external success. Jung noted that this crisis, while painful, often becomes the catalyst for integration. The psyche essentially forces a reckoning between the authentic and adapted selves. Patients would come to him saying things like, "I don't know who I am anymore," or "I feel like I'm living someone else's life." But Jung also documented something remarkable. Patients who successfully navigated this crisis and learned to integrate their split selves didn't just return to their previous functioning. They achieved levels of psychological integration and effectiveness that exceeded anything they'd experienced before the splitting began. The remarkable news is that Jung didn't just identify the problem, he developed specific integration methods based on decades of clinical work with intuitive introverts who successfully bridged their two worlds. Jung observed that healing begins with what he called conscious recognition, becoming explicitly aware of your splitting patterns rather than operating them unconsciously. As Jung noted, the goal is to make unconscious patterns conscious so you can choose rather than be chosen by them. The first phase Jung documented was developing awareness of the split itself. This means recognizing the specific moments when you edit or suppress your perceptions, when you perform uncertainty about things you know, when you absorb others' emotional content, and when you provide adapted responses rather than authentic ones. Jung had patients track these patterns systematically, not to judge them, but to understand them. He observed that most intuitive introverts operate their splitting mechanisms so automatically that they don't realize how extensive the editing has become. The second phase Jung called conscious compensation. Instead of letting your inferior sensation function operate unconsciously through symptoms and compulsions, Jung advocated for deliberately developing your connection to physical reality. Jung was clear: you're not trying to become a sensation type. You're developing enough conscious relationship with sensation to support your intuitive function rather than having it sabotaged by unconscious compensation. Jung recommended deliberate grounding protocols, regular engagement with physical reality through structured activities that connect you to your body and the present moment. This might include gardening, cooking, crafts, or exercise that requires present moment focus. Jung observed that conscious sensation development helps intuitive introverts distinguish between physical environmental stimuli and psychological energy readings, between their own emotional states and absorbed emotional content, between intuitive perceptions and anxious projections. The third phase Jung documented was developing what he called conscious choice in sharing perceptions, choosing strategically when, how, and with whom to share your authentic perceptions. Jung observed that successful integration doesn't mean being completely authentic with everyone. Instead, it means making conscious choices rather than operating from automatic suppression or unconscious revelation. Jung documented that integrated patients develop different levels of authenticity for different relationships. They identify safe harbor relationships where they can exist without psychological editing. They develop professional frameworks that honor their abilities within acceptable contexts. They learn to adapt consciously rather than reactively. Jung observed that the deepest healing happens when intuitive introverts learn to build bridges between their perceptual world and others' more conventional ways of understanding. This involves developing translation skills. Instead of sharing insights as definitive statements, which can feel threatening to others, Jung taught patients to frame them as collaborative exploration. Instead of saying, "Your sister is manipulating you," learning to say, "I'm curious about something I'm noticing in your interactions with your sister. Would you be open to exploring it together?" Jung noted that intuitive introverts often achieve their greatest professional success when they learn to work with their natural abilities rather than despite them. This means finding ways to use your perceptual abilities effectively within existing professional frameworks. In healthcare settings, this might mean developing clinical language for energy observations. In educational contexts, framing student energy readings as learning style observations. In management roles, presenting team dynamic insights as organizational behavior analysis. Jung documented that mastered intuitive introverts develop conscious control of permeability, the ability to consciously control when and how much they absorb from others. This involves setting explicit intentions before challenging interpersonal situations, visualizing protective boundaries while maintaining openness to genuine perception, practicing observing without absorbing, and developing post-interaction cleansing protocols. Jung documented specific markers that indicate successful integration. Internally, this manifests as decreased exhaustion from constant self-monitoring, more spontaneous, authentic responses in appropriate situations, clearer distinction between your emotions and others, and increased confidence in your perceptions. Relationally, integration appears as having at least one relationship where you can be fully yourself. Decreased resentment about being misunderstood, better ability to identify people who can handle your authenticity, and more satisfying professional relationships. Professionally, integration manifests as using your natural abilities to enhance your work rather than hiding them, developing a reputation for good instincts and insight, less stress about professional performance, and career advancement based on authentic strengths. Jung believed that the ultimate goal isn't to eliminate the split between your inner perception and outer adaptation. It's to make the management of this split conscious and deliberate rather than unconscious and reactive. Jung's clinical work with intuitive introverts revealed a profound insight. The double life isn't a psychological flaw to be eliminated. It's a capacity that can be consciously mastered. The exhaustion you feel isn't a flaw in your psychological design. It's a signal that you're operating from unconscious compensation rather than conscious integration. Your sensitivity isn't the problem. The suppression of your sensitivity is what creates the exhaustion. Your perceptions aren't too intense. Your need to hide them is what creates the internal pressure. You don't need to become someone else. You need to become more consciously, skillfully yourself. The double life isn't something to eliminate, it's something to master. The goal is to become fluent in both worlds, the world of immediate perception and the world of gradual understanding. Jung observed in his clinical practice that successfully integrated intuitive introverts developed the ability to bridge different worlds of understanding, not by hiding their abilities, but by learning to share them in ways that others can receive and use. They become the people others seek out when something doesn't feel right, but they can't identify what. They become trusted advisors whose good instincts are valued, even if their methods aren't understood. They become the ones who can see what's coming and help others prepare without creating panic or resistance. Jung recognized that integrated intuitive introverts serve a crucial function in human development. They can perceive psychological patterns before they become obvious. They sense the health of relationships, organizations, and communities in ways that can guide healing and growth. But Jung's work also suggests that this capacity comes with responsibility. Your gift isn't just the ability to perceive, it's the potential to help others understand what they cannot see alone. This means learning to use your abilities in service rather than in hiding. When you stop pretending you don't see what you see and start learning how to share it skillfully, something remarkable happens. You stop feeling like an alien in your own life. You find your people, other integrated individuals who understand your experience. You discover your purpose, the unique way you're meant to translate unconscious wisdom for the world. Jung documented in his clinical work that patients who successfully navigated this integration didn't just return to their previous functioning. They achieved levels of psychological effectiveness, relational depth, and professional impact that exceeded anything they'd experienced before the splitting began. The world needs what you see, but it needs it delivered in ways that create connection rather than distance, trust rather than fear, hope rather than overwhelm. Your sensitivity is not a burden to be managed. It's a gift to be refined and shared. Jung's clinical observations suggest this. The suffering of the double life is not meaningless. It's the cost of unconscious compensation, and it can be transformed through conscious integration into your greatest strength and your most profound contribution to the world. The exhausting performance of pretending you're not sensitive can end. The loneliness of hiding your perceptions can be healed. The professional stagnation that comes from working against your nature can be transformed. But it requires a choice. The choice to stop adapting unconsciously and start integrating consciously. The choice to stop hiding your gifts and start refining them. The choice to stop living in the split and start building bridges between your two worlds. As Jung observed through his clinical work, when intuitive introverts learn to honor their perceptions while developing the skills to share them effectively, they don't just heal their own psychological splitting, they can become agents of healing for the splits in others, in relationships, in organizations, and in society itself. The goal isn't to choose between your two worlds, it's to become the conscious bridge between them. Stop pretending you don't see what you see. Start learning how to share it skillfully. The world is waiting for what only you can offer. Which stage of the double life are you living in right now? Are you in stage 1, just beginning to learn that your perceptions need to be hidden? Stage 2, exhausted from the constant performance of being normal? Or stage 3, ready to stop the splitting and start integrating consciously? Share your stage in the comments below. And what's been the most exhausting part of maintaining your adapted persona? Your story might be exactly what another intuitive introvert needs to hear to know they're not alone in this psychological journey. Thousands of people have found it to be the first time they finally felt understood. Until then, stop pretending you don't see what you see. Start learning to share it skillfully. And remember, your sensitivity isn't a flaw to be fixed. It's a gift to be integrated.